Hey, everybody. We are the Good Doctors of Abbey Research, as ever, Dr. Aaron.
Dr. Kristen.
And we're here with our filler time between, what we wanted to cover and The Crown. So we're up to the last thing. Next week starts The Crown. Super exciting. And as you know, if you've been following us, we've been talking about women and history and politics and all sorts of things over the last few months. And we scoured the bowels of the HBO documentary list to find something that we thought would be interesting to talk about and to learn about. And we found Triangle: Remembering the Fire, which is a 39-minute documentary about, and it was produced in 2011, so the 100-year anniversary of the Triangle Shirt Factory fire, which was in, I have it down, March of 1911, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And it's very famous. Like, I remember learning about it in history class growing up, but I remembered 0% of why we learned about it. So I was like, oh yeah, that sounds familiar. I have no idea what happened or why it's significant. Great news. This documentary tells us all those things. So the short story of it is that a fire breaks out at a shirtwaist factory. And there were lots of issues why, or reasons why so many people died. So there was a miscommunication from the dispatch where they forgot to notify the 9th floor that there was a fire. The fire trucks arrived and their ladders weren't long enough to get to the 9th floor. And there was also a court case later about the fact that one of the escape doors was locked and barred. And so then it prevented people from getting out. All of this led to a horrible fire and the death of 146 workers. 129 of them were women and girls. And it spends a lot of time with the families and the descendants of the people who died and survived. And it talks a lot about the personal experiences of people with the fire, which was very upsetting. But it's also a huge moment for labor rights in the United States and workers' protection. Another aspect of the story was that these businesses were not mandated legally to install things like fire escapes or the brand new invented sprinkler systems and other sort of protections for workers. And so they didn't, because they didn't have to, and thus the fire was as awful as it was. And so this leads to a huge commission, the scandal of it all, that eventually forms a lot of the foundation of the New Deal, which I would assume is why I learned about it in elementary school or middle school history class. But it brings in a lot of standards. It ushers in discussions about the minimum wage, supporting people who are fired, supporting people who are too old to work, like all of these things that we have now in place. A lot of it came from the tragedy of the Triangle Shirt Factory fire. So yeah, we've got a couple interesting things we discovered as we talked about what we learned from it that we want to share with you. So I'll kick it over to Dr. Kristen for your thoughts.
So the first thing is that this is one of the foundations of OSHA.
Yeah.
And if you've just heard OSHA and you don't really know what it is, OSHA stands for Occupational Safety and Health Administration.
Dr. Kristen knows a lot about OSHA.
There are beautiful things about OSHA. Just like almost every government agency, I said almost, there are some really, really great things about it. I believe in limited regulation. I'll say that. I don't ever believe in completely, getting rid of regulation. And I don't love over-regulation. So I'm a big fan of balance. OSHA is often not one of the organizations where I want that much balance. I'm actually more okay with over-regulation because there's a lot of small ways that things at a factory especially can hurt people if people are dumb. So what we have now is a lot more regulations against things like the fire. We're still figuring out how to regulate against people being dumb. I'm not entirely sure we'll ever get there. But we have a lot more paperwork now and some other things like that. OSHA has some things that I think are like, really, I have to fill out paperwork about that. But I'll take that over 100 women melted together in a like, and people being not able to be identified at all because we didn't have dental records back in 1911.
Yeah.
So
some of the details of this were just, the melted together humans was.
It was a lot. Lots of women jumping to their death, which then again happened on 9/11. Also happened a year later on the Titanic. We can talk about the human psychology of wanting to die in your own terms when things like this happen.
Yeah.
And the solidarity of women jumping together.
Yeah, I think in particularly too, like with things like either drowning and or fire are really like horrible ways to die.
Yeah. And I think a lot of them, they're fears of ours innately. Like I have a fear of being burned alive. That's one of my like fears. So I'd probably jump.
My mom has like an unfounded fear of drowning. Like it doesn't come from an experience of hers. She just has. So like, those two things particularly touch an innate, like primal part of us.
Yeah.
But like we would rather fall through a glass floor and break our necks jumping from a 9th-story building than experience burning to death.
Yeah, and I think there is something about the human, because I'm sure at some point they knew they were jumping to their deaths, but there's always the chance they might not be.
Yeah, and some of them survived.
And some of them survived. Like, you know, especially now you just get really maimed potentially because somebody might catch you, et cetera, et cetera. Let me say to you, this building still stands.
Yes, it does. I know. Next time we're in New York, I want to go.
Yeah, which is down by Washington Square Park, which you people who don't know New York know because it's the arch in the beginning of Friends. So that's how you know Washington Square Park. So I was really interested to kind of see from a perspective of somebody who deals with OSHA on a decently regular basis. It's a good reminder. A lot of business folks need reminding of why we have some of the things that we have. And this is a really good documentary to remind us why we have OSHA. And I also want to say just really briefly, there are quite a lot of business owners on this country that would have had the sprinklers just because it was a good thing to do. It's very easy to demonize business owners, especially in the labor movement, as that all businesses during the labor movement were treating workers this poorly. They were not. We have lots of documentation actually of workers being treated properly at places. They just didn't tend to be the larger ones. They just didn't tend to be the things that make history because doing the right thing doesn't tend to make history. But what really made these guys stand out as the owners was their unparalleled greed. And their unregulated greed. So the reason that the doors were locked was because they checked the girls' bags every single day to make sure they weren't stealing shirtwaists. Their profit margin on shirtwaists, I found out from somebody else, was around 78%. Just a heads up, an average margin of something like this would be around 30 now.
78% profit margin.
78% margin they got. Yeah.
I used to work in retail, for those of you that don't know that. And so I dealt a lot with like why things are priced the way that they are and how you make a profit on things. And like, the most we ever did was like maybe sometimes 50%, depending on how cheap the item was.
Yeah. And about supply and demand, there's a whole lot of reasons you play with margins and
it's usually around 30% for like goods and services. Yeah.
But like so, and I don't know, I mean, let me say like that was in a couple sources, but like, who knows how accurate that is. So like grain of salt. Like I found it on a business article, but like, who knows? The fashion industry does have obscene margins now based on how they pay their labor. So if you would like to fall down a rabbit hole of proper of labor and fashion, just Google Primark and sweatshops and have fun. Never shopping there again. Just kidding. But fashion has always had a very high markup. Compared to labor, always. Cheap clothing has been a bastion of Western society since the cotton trade began. It's one of the reasons that the entire economy of the Southern United States was built on cotton, was because of fast, cheap fashion. Oh my gosh, I lost the word. Sorry. So when you make a little bit of money, if you're not emotionally careful, it's very easy to want to make all of the money.
Uh-huh.
And these two gentlemen were set up in a solution where they bought into the American myth. They were both immigrants. They bought into the American myth that they were then owed this. You didn't have to understand some of the early 20th century in America. You have to understand the earliest 20th century elsewhere, where getting business licenses was impossible if you didn't know somebody who knew somebody, if you weren't from the right family, if you weren't part of the royal family in some of these countries, if you weren't in the right political party, if you weren't in the right church. The United States at the turn, one of the reasons the Industrial Revolution took off for us in such a way was that we didn't have emotional or social regulations on businesses either. Nowhere on the planet had safety regulation, let's be clear, but we didn't have the social or emotional ones. And so they felt they were due this as human beings, and society affirmed them. Society, they got access to things, and they had massive houses. And by the way, that one dude's house looks exactly like where Jeffrey Epstein ended up living. So like that was a connection in my brain.
Ooh, that's not
but like that architecture, like, yeah, of that brownstone is very similar to the one he ended up living in. So they were these very specific men who locked the doors to make sure they wouldn't lose 5 cents a day.
Yeah. And I think, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and so as leaders, it's incredibly important to remember that, yes, you have to make money to keep the lights on. Profit is good. Margin is important. But you know what else is? Human lives. And so there were probably other creative ways of making sure that you weren't having a ton of theft, like accurate bookkeeping, rather than locking the doors. But at no point in time in their construction of the building did anything that happened say that they cared about their workers at all. They absolutely saw them as disposable. They absolutely saw them as turns in the wheel. We see this in the suffrage movie On the Other Side of the Pond that we watched a little bit ago. You see this in the movie North and South too, with not the Patrick Swayze one, the British one, but workers in textile mills were interchangeable because it was not considered highly skilled labor, even though any of us who have ever operated a sewing machine know that it is highly skilled labor. We just didn't consider it because it was the work of women and girls. So
yeah, and so I think the documentary did a good job of not saying like all owners were like this. Like they told the very specific story of the factory, but there was a lot. Obviously, there was enough within the findings of the Factory Commission, enough things happening at different places to institute a lot of these reforms and regulations. And the other thing that we talked about watching this was the power of kind of collective experiences of events and collective grief and mourning, and the way that intersected with print media to kind of keep this story in the public eye in a way that, had it happened prior to the dominance of news media, it would not have been something people saw. But for me, what was so visually arresting that they showed throughout the documentary was the continuing headlines, the stories that came out. And that was something that was like common at the time, because the Titanic becomes embedded in our cultural memory because of the stories of the people that end up in the newspaper. And they keep telling these stories and you keep hearing about what happened. And so that it gave it a lot of, there was a lot of petrol in the tank for this story. And the fact that they all were of migrant and immigrant communities in a particular part of New York City on the Lower East Side, living next door to each other, down the street from each other, across the road. And the way that they collectively grieved as a community was really powerful in fomenting this kind of movement, right? And they show you this, and we talked about it offline, this kind of like collective funeral that they had for everyone, that led to that's how people organize. Then you're standing around at this funeral, you're saying, oh, this is a terrible thing that happened. Oh yeah. What can we do about it? I don't know. Like, that's how people start organizing. That's how labor movements
begin
and happen. And we've talked about the Aberfan disaster in Wales and the mining town that led to, a huge miners' strike. And so these tragedies have a way of pushing
impetus.
Putting impetus behind movements. And so it was, I found that part fascinating. I wish they would have spent a little bit more time on that. It could have been a little bit longer or less time with the families for my taste. Because but that's just me personally, I was more interested in how the story kept staying in the public eye, and then how it led to this commission that led to these changes that led to, et cetera, the New Deal. So I'd like a follow-up documentary.
I'm sure there is one somewhere.
Yeah.
Like, this feels like something.
Yeah.
I'm sure this is something that has launched a lot of PhDs.
Yeah.
So it's really, Triangle has become a shorthand in American society in a lot of ways, but a lot of us don't have the either patience, wherewithal, or opportunity to dig into what that really means. Mm-hmm. And so we hope that as we've spent a little bit of time unpacking, we're 110 years on, and a lot of these same narratives are happening again. Mm-hmm. How do we balance human life, and how do we balance the various facets of human life, their physical safety and also being able to sign their paycheck? Mm-hmm. This is a major conversation in COVID right now. How do we keep people safe and also keep them employed? Mm-hmm. How do we make sure everybody can eat? And how do we make sure everybody doesn't get COVID? And these tensions are going to exist forever, mm-hmm. I think, because that's just the nature of a market economy. But they don't exist in tension in some other like totalitarian dictator states, because the first part of that equation doesn't really matter to people. Yeah, exactly. So in any situation in which people's autonomy and liberty matter, these tensions are gonna crunch. It's incredibly important. We talk all the time, honestly, offline, about how Americans are really, really bad at our own history. Mm. And this is one of those examples of something that we should it shouldn't just be shorthand. It should be something we actually know. Mm-hmm. It should be something that we actually actively remember. Is like, okay, well, maybe what we have right now isn't great for X, Y, and Z reasons, but you know what we don't want to be? The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Right. So how do we, let's not pretend that we didn't get here for reasons, mm-hmm. and let's investigate those reasons before we throw babies out with bathwater. And how do we kind of do all of these things? So on a national level, a very important lesson, perhaps also an important lesson for your individual organization.
We hope
and
so.
How do you deal with context, and how do you deal with change and still holding the tension of keeping the lights on and keeping people safe?
And with that tension and those thoughts, either on a national or a local level, we will leave you. We will see you all next week for the start of The Crown Season 4. We're a little bit nervous about it. If we lost you during our Season 3 coverage because we talked so much about Northern Ireland, sorry, not sorry. It's probably going to come up again. Spoiler alert.
We are both excited and nervous to see Gillian Anderson's portrayal of Margaret Thatcher. I am very intrigued to see Freddie Fox's portrayal of Mark Thatcher. Mm-hmm. Freddie Fox is fresh off of the Murders at White House Farm, in which he plays a murderer, and it is very good at it. So I'll be interested to see his turn as Mark Thatcher. And then, always we would love more from Josh O'Connor about being Charles. He's wonderful. But we are nervous about how they're going to handle the murder of Lord Mountbatten. Yes, and many other things as we journey through the 1980s in British politics and the history of the United Kingdom. So we will see you all then for that, or if you are not a Crown fan, after that coverage. Take care, everybody. Bye.